You would know the story behind this. You were training a lot at the Jet Center, Benny the Jet, because there's a story that you hear that Benny the Jet was going to fight one of the Gracies. There's a big challenge back in the day, but for whatever reason, it never happened. So, what's the story behind that? You were there, with both sides during that time.
Yeah, always. Hoyce even went and did a bit of training down at the Jet Center, funnily enough.
Oh,
But
okay.
yeah, there was a challenge, but it's you got to before I even start with that, and I don't want to get too detailed because I don't know all the details, except I know there was a challenge because obviously Benny having such a name, already a legendary status as a kickboxer with Gracie's wanting to put themselves on the map, what better than to challenge someone like Benny?
Sure.
And I believe there was a certain amount of money offered. It was supposed to be, and look, I might be speaking out of turn, and don't get me into trouble here, but whatever it was, they were going to put up the money for Benny to fight. It then started to turn out that they also wanted Benny to put up an equivalent amount of money, to which he said, "But you're the ones challenging me. I'm the one with the name, right? You want to fight me because you think you can beat me and thereby get the value of the recognition. So why would I have to put up the money if you're the ones that are confident you can beat me?"
That makes sense.
And there was some discussion over that. There was also, I guess, some disparity in the choice of rules and what that was going to look like. But I do know Benny was training with Gene LaBelle at the time to prepare for that fight. Because Benny's the sort, he really isn't interested in all that kind of who's better, who's not, and everything else. But the one thing about Benny, which I know, is if you challenge him, he will absolutely accept. You know what I mean? He's that kind of a warrior, but he's not the one that'll instigate that in any way, shape, or form. And I just want to mention that because it's a very important character element, in Benny's whole makeup and psyche. But he was quite prepared for the fight. I know he was training hard for it at the Jet Center. And again, whether it's rule changes or an issue over money, it eventually didn't happen, which I tend to think is a good thing, but that's about as much as I can remember about that.
Yeah, as far as you know, so was it just supposed to be like a private encounter and not for like an audience? Because you think if it was for an audience, promoters would put up the money for both sides because there would be people that would want to see it. It's just
Yeah.
weird that the two different camps would, hypothetically have to put up their own money and they would fight for that prize.
It's a good question, David. And I wouldn't, I don't know. I don't know whether it was supposed to be just maybe at either the Jet Center or at the Gracie Academy, at that time. I don't know the answer to that because you're right. Yes, if it was going to be a money-making event, and yes, the money would definitely show up. I'm not sure back then it was even about that. Remember, this is all before UFC, so it was more a question of again just getting a bit of punch and authority behind the Gracie name in a place like the US and in Los Angeles. So, but again, yes, I won't speak out of turn because I don't know the details of where the fight was supposed to happen. I just know it was on the cards, was supposed to happen, didn't happen because of rule changes and or money or some aspects over that. Yeah, not sure.
Yeah, you'd almost think because I think the first UFC was like 93 or 94, and I know they almost got and they wanted to. Don Wilson told me the story quite a bit where they basically had him up against Matt Hughes, and he and Dana White agreed on a number. But when Don got the actual contract, it was like a fraction of what he was told. So he was like insulted and never ended up fighting Matt Hughes in the UFC. But you'd almost think like Dana White, because obviously Benny was still young enough and still had the name. You'd almost think Dana White would want Benny to fight Gracie in the UFC. That could have been interesting.
Sure. Yeah, I again, when the UFC started, I don't even know whether that offer was still on the table, whether Benny wasn't interested again. I have no idea about that. But what I do know is I do know having trained, albeit as a complete novice, when I was training with Hickson and then training in the garages, I do know that so many of my stand-up fighters friends had no idea of the skill set of people like Henzo or Hoyce or Horion or any of these people. I mean, it's been proven, well, Hoyce proved that in the UFC. How many UFC stand-up fighters, would come in gis with the Hapkido karate and think they obviously wouldn't have been there if they didn't think they had a chance, and Hoyce took them all out. So that was a big wake-up call to stand-up fighters about how easily, again, a skilled grappler, albeit BJJ or wrestler, could take a stand-up fighter off his feet. And it changed the whole culture of martial arts. And people began to realize that one art by itself is not necessarily enough.
Mhm.
So the stand-up fighters realized they had to get some grappling skills, and the grapplers realized also they had to get some striking skills. Because they used to say the worst person for a BJJ fighter is a puncher who can grapple or a wrestler who can punch, because it's very difficult to take a quality wrestler off his feet. And if he can also punch, then you're left in the stand-up world. Do you know what I mean? Whereas the
Yeah.
great, all they want to do is get you down on your back. Now you're in their arena. So as I said, for both sides, it was a bit of a wake-up call. And I don't think that was a bad thing at all that the UFC brought in, that we had to understand, well, this is a whole different environment now. We need didn't mean you have to be the great grappler, but if you're a great striker, you need a grappling skills, and vice versa. If you're a great grappler, at least have striking skills to survive a striker's onslaught and maybe get that striker onto his back. I mean, that just seemed to make perfect sense. I was actually doing color commentary for the very first No Rules match that Henzo Gracie had. It was in Puerto Rico again in the early 80s. And I went with Bob Wall and we were doing color, and Henzo fought, I forget the gentleman's name, but a judo guy. But there were no weight divisions. There was another guy called Bart Vale. People would remember Bart was, God, he was like 250 pound, big
Wow.
left striker. There were a lot of interesting people. And as I said, this was the time that before the UFC had weight divisions. So that was also very, very interesting. See, Henzo ended up winning that, because anyone who knows Henzo is just the loveliest guy. But man, is he fiery and is he a fighter? That guy is the real deal. So again, it's exciting to have been part of that whole history of the start of the introduction of the grappler into the stand-up fighters world, to put it in simplistic terms. And I remember in the school in the Valley that Bob Wall brought Bart Vale into the school. Bob, I think not so rightly, was kind of like to try and match people. So he brought Bart Vale into the Machado school when they had their school in the Valley, and one of them basically wanted Bart to wrestle with Hegan, right? So they shape up. Bart Vale suddenly throws a kick at Hegan, and
Mm.
Hegan's like, oh, he going to kick? Ends up taking Bart Vale down and dislocated Bart Vale's shoulder, and that was the end of that. But it was again an interesting time of strikers, I believe, not through not having done enough of it and understanding the grappler's world and how bloody good some of those guys were. And you couldn't tell unless you wrestled with them. If you watched back then grappling out of ignorance, it looks like just two dudes rolling around like in a schoolyard. But when you get on the ground with a Higan or a Jean-Jacques Machado or a Hickson Gracie, the absolute control they have over a novice is just astounding. So,
I've actually experienced that, and I was like shocked. This was a while ago in Tarzana. There's like a Tarzana boxing and fitness, and one of the guys was Royce Gracie's sparring partner. So obviously he had to be good, if that's the guy that he always works out with. Anyway,
yeah.
it was more of a boxing gym, but they did do like BJJ classes once a week. I went to a few of them. Anyway, he would spar, lightly with everybody, would get their shot at the instructor, and just what he was able to do so effortlessly, you're just like, wow. Like I get what you're like completely helpless. You're like in quicksand. You're, you know.
It's such a complex, it's like a absolutely elite physical chess game. I mean, and again, obviously people now know what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is. Back then, though, you had to experience to go, I'm fucked. There's nothing I can do, and that just intrigued the life out of me, which is why I took it up and was training 6 days a week with Jean-Jacques, and still, what is it, 35 years later, still doing it. It's just a wonderful, wonderful art. And the thing about wrestling with good guys like a Higgin is they almost look like they're going to sleep while they're tying you up in knots. Do you know what I mean? It's almost effortless when these amazing sort of professors, as they call them, do what they do.
I have a funny story related to that though when you mentioned wrestling because I just wanted to test it out and I didn't know what I was doing, so I was just wrestling the guy, on my knees and I suplexed him, just kind of flipped him over me and he kind of got pinned against the wall. So, he was kind of like stuck there. So he just like tapped. And then some because nobody and obviously I didn't have like a good submission. He just wanted to get out, of that position. And I overheard somebody in the class said, "Did he tap? Like he's never tapped?" And I could tell that pissed him off because right after that he just like pretzeled me in so many ways. Like I had to tap like 5 times within just a few minutes. Yeah, I was like, okay. But again, I didn't know what I was doing. I was just like wrestling the guy.
No, I know. Well, as we know about Americans, you have it in colleges and everything. It's
Sure,
like us.
yeah. I mean, I had to do it in middle school and high school.
Yeah.
It's just part of the curriculum. So you have
We
at least
played
a basic skill set.
Yeah, well, we played Aussie rules football and you guys wrestled. And yeah, so, collegiate wrestlers, we all know how amazing they are conditioning wise and everything else. But the difference, as we know, for those who don't know, with collegiate wrestling is it's not a submission art. It's about pinning somebody's back to the floor and all of that. Whereas jiu-jitsu guys don't care if they're on their backs. They have incredible attacks underneath as well as on top. They have arm bars, they have chokes, none of which a wrestler can do. So, and you'll see with the UFC, that's when everything changed because the wrestlers were always, as I said, amazingly conditioned, endurance-wise, strength-wise, and everything, takedown defenses and takedowns. What they didn't have the submissions. But once they went, oh, okay, now I need to understand the guard, passing the guard, the mount, side control, and all of that. Once they started to do that, you saw the whole balance change. So now it wasn't the Brazilians as being the elite. Now it was whoever was going to invest time in learning Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And by the way, the last thing I want to say about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's called Brazilian. It originally came from the Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. I forget the gentleman's name who went to Brazil. Helio trained, with this Brazilian and realized how incredible it was. But it was Ilio and Carlos Gracie that basically modified the Japanese jiu-jitsu. They would argue 60% of it is more what they modified from the original Japanese jiu-jitsu, which was more almost like samurai-based joint locks and everything, defending against somebody in armor, blah, 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 somebody with a sword. So it became a whole different art under Ilio and Carlos Gracie, and hence they calling it Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, meaning their expression again of the grappling art. And I remember back that day, everybody, the word got out very quickly. Like, we can talk later, but I knew Steven Seagal and we were friends, and Stephen called me asking me about the Machados and what would I think about using them in one of his movies, which happened to be Under Siege 2. And we were talking about them, and I remember saying what I thought about, the Machados at that time. And he basically, this is another thing, where we talk about stories of Stephen thinking there's nobody better. But I remember him saying to me, he said, "Oh man, I don't know how you would defeat one of those guys. They're that good." So he ended up using, I'm pretty sure it was John Machado and somebody else in Under Siege 2. They did a fight on a train. It was a big fight. And I'd read where Stephen trained in BJJ, but the only training he did was for that fight scene with, I believe it was John Machado in Under Siege 2. But yeah, but I remember the absolute respect Stephen had for the Machados, and of course they were thrilled to hook up with Stephen and work in a movie. So Yeah, that's another little
Yeah.
historical tidbit.
Oh, that's cool. Let's get into
Yeah.
Steven in 1 second. Just a quick question because you said Benny the Jet was training with Jean LaBelle, who's known as like an amazing grappler. Have you ever trained or rolled with Jean LaBelle?